The swamp is a wet, green lung that breathes in people and exhales only rot and static. In the Atchafalaya Basin, the heat doesn't just sit on you, it invades you, thick and heavy as a wet wool blanket soaked in stagnant water. I've spent 12 years as a wildlife enforcement officer, but the deep, unnavigable interior of the basin is a place where the law of man stops and something far older takes over. I was out there alone, pushing my skiff through corridors of cypress knees that looked like jagged teeth rising from the black tea of the water. I was looking for Bryce Park. Bryce was a veteran trapper, a man who knew the tides and the gator holes better than his own reflection, yet he'd missed 3 consecutive radio check-ins. In this part of Louisiana, silence isn't just gold, it's a funeral shroud. I found his camp at dawn. The air was a wall of humid green, the sunlight struggling to pierce the canopy. It looked like he'd been interrupted in the middle of a meal. A tin plate of beans sat on a folding table, half-eaten and buzzing with flies. But it was the ground that stopped my heart. 2 perfectly parallel drag marks, deep and clean, led from the center of the camp straight into the water. These weren't the erratic, thrashing ruts of an alligator's death roll. These marks were steady, level, and exactly shoulder-width apart. Something had picked Bryce up and walked him into the dark water, carrying him like a heavy piece of lumber. I followed the trail into a thicket where the swamp felt like a void. The usual cacophony of bullfrogs and crickets had flatlined into an oppressive silence. That's when I saw him. Bryce was wedged 8 feet up in the fork of a gnarled tupelo tree. His chest cavity had been opened with a precision that made my stomach turn, neat, smooth cuts through the bone, as if a master butcher had used a diamond blade. But the most terrifying part wasn't the wound. It was the fact that despite the 90-degree heat and the swarming insects, Bryce showed 0 signs of decomposition. His skin was pale and firm, preserved in a way that defied every law of biology I knew. Caching, a voice rasped behind me. I spun around, hand on my holster. Bo Gardner, a veteran guide who'd seen more than any man should, stood there in a pirogue, his face a map of deep-set wrinkles and dread. He told me the things in the trees weren't just dead, they were being stored. Like a larder for winter. Bo didn't wait for me to process the horror. He began tracking, his eyes locked on the subtle disturbances in the duckweed. We went deeper than the maps go, into a graveyard of cypress roots where the water turned the color of dried blood. That's where we found it, the mound. It was a massive, 12-foot structure of packed mud and Spanish moss, but as we got closer, the Gothic reality revealed itself. Human bones, ribs, femurs, and radius bones were woven into the structure, reinforcing the walls like rebar. As we approached, a voice drifted out from the base of the mound. It was high-pitched, thin, and sounded exactly like a missing girl from a file I'd memorized weeks ago. It was calling her mother's name. It wasn't a person, though. It was a mimicry, a hollow recording played back through a throat made of gristle. I couldn't stop myself. I drew my sidearm and slipped into the submerged tunnel at the base of the mound, the water closing over my head like a cold hand. Inside was an air pocket that smelled of ozone and ancient mud. My flashlight beam cut through the dark and landed on a clutch of 12 large, leathery eggs, each the size of a watermelon, pulsing with a faint, sickly light. Behind them, 2 flat, white eyes reflected my light. The creature was humanoid but elongated, its skin the color of a drowned man, its limbs ending in hooked, multi-jointed fingers. Before I could even scream, it launched. It didn't swim. It blurred through the water with a terrifying, predatory speed. Bo's hand caught my collar, dragging me backward through the tunnel just as the creature's claws raked the air where my face had been. We broke the surface and scrambled toward a capsized aluminum boat snagged on a log. The creature was right behind us, the duckweed parting in a violent V as it surged through the waist-deep water. Bo shoved me up onto the hull of the boat, but he didn't climb up. He stayed in the water, his boots sinking into the muck. He looked at me with a grim finality and held up 4 fingers. 40 seconds. That was the price he was setting for my life. I didn't waste them. I didn't look back as the water around Bo began to churn. I lunged for the small outboard motor that had been detached from the boat, shoved it deep into the mound's entrance, and ripped the fuel line open. The smell of gasoline filled the humid air, mixing with the scent of the swamp. I scrambled back, pulled my flare gun, and fired. The world turned orange. The mound didn't just burn, it detonated as the trapped fumes ignited. A massive column of fire roared into the canopy, vaporizing the moss and the mud and the things inside. The shockwave knocked me flat against the aluminum hull. When the smoke cleared, There was nothing left but charred wood and a simmering black hole in the water. Bo was gone. I survived. I wrote the report. I told the department Bo died in a tragic boating accident so his family could get the line of duty payout. I told them the fire destroyed everything. But every night, I stare at the official evidence file. The investigators recovered the remains of 9 eggs from the ashes. They put it in the report like it was a victory. But I was in that nest. I counted them with my own eyes. There were 12. Somewhere in the 1.4 million acres of the Atchafalaya, 3 of those things have hatched, and they're growing in the dark, waiting for the silence to return. The Atchafalaya Basin doesn't just swallow people, it digests them. It's a 1.4 million acre labyrinth of cypress knees, duckweed, and secrets that prefer to stay submerged in the black, prehistoric tea of the swamp. I've been a wildlife enforcement officer out here for a decade, and I've learned that the silence isn't an absence of noise. It's a warning. When the cicadas stop their rhythmic soaring and the bullfrogs go mute, something is moving that isn't supposed to be. Bryce Park was a veteran trapper who knew these waters better than his own heartbeat. He was a man who lived by the radio and the tides. When he missed 3 consecutive check-ins, the static on the other end of the line didn't just sound like dead air. It sounded like a countdown. I pushed my skiff into the deep interior, where the maps turn into vague green blurs and the GPS signal dies a slow, digital death. The air was a thick, wet wool blanket, smelling of diesel and ancient rot. I found Bryce's camp on a small rise of mud and gnarled roots. It was a scene of interrupted domesticity. A pot of coffee sat cold on a rusted burner. His skinning knife was still stuck in a half-finished pelt. But it was the ground that turned my stomach. Most people think an alligator attack is a messy affair of thrashing tails and red water. But these marks were different. 2 perfectly parallel grooves were etched into the soft silt, leading straight from the center of the camp into the dark water. They were deep and rhythmic, spaced exactly like the heels of a man being dragged. But there was no sign of a body being hauled along the ground. No flattened grass. No smear of mud. Whatever had taken Bryce had held him up, carrying his weight from his shoulders, walking him out of his life with a terrifying, level precision. I followed that trail through the waist-deep sludge, the water pushing against my chest like a heavy hand. The sunlight was a sickly, dappled yellow, filtered through curtains of Spanish moss that hung like grey, rotting hair from the cypress limbs. That's when I saw it. I didn't smell it first, which was the first impossible thing. In this heat, a body should announce itself from a mile away. But the air was sterile, cold even. I looked up. Bryce Park was wedged 8 feet high in the crotch of an ancient, moss-choked oak. He looked like a discarded doll, his limbs draped at angles that defied anatomy. But as I climbed the lower branches, my gorge rose. His chest had been opened. It wasn't a tear or a bite. It was a surgical, vertical incision that ran from his collarbone to his navel. The ribs hadn't been crushed, they had been cut. I touched the edge of the bone, and it was smooth, as if a hot wire or a diamond-edged blade had passed through the calcium without a single splinter. His internal organs were gone, replaced by a packing of damp, green moss that seemed to be pulsing with a faint, rhythmic heat. There was 0 decomposition. No flies. No maggots. Just Bryce, preserved in a state of horrific, static perfection. He was a trophy. He was a cache. A shadow shifted in the peripheral of my vision. I reached for my sidearm, but a hand as hard as a mahogany root clamped over my wrist. It was Bo Gardner. He was a guide who had been part of the swamp's folklore since before I was born, a man who looked like he was made of leather and would smoke. He didn't say a word. He just pointed at the body, then at the deep, dark heart of the basin. He whispered one word: caching. Predators do it when they have more than they can eat, when they're preparing for something that hasn't arrived yet. Bo didn't wait for me to process the horror. He began to move, tracking things I couldn't see, a bent reed, a bubble in the muck, a sense of wrongness in the air. We pushed deeper, into a part of the Atchafalaya that felt like the dawn of time. We found them there. 2 more bodies, tucked away in the high branches like forgotten winter coats. They were from the open missing persons files, a college student who had vanished 3 months ago and a surveyor who had gone off the grid in the spring. Both were opened with the same clinical precision. Both were stuffed with that living, breathing moss. Then, the trees gave way to a clearing of stagnant, black water. In the center, anchored to the massive, flared roots of a dead cypress, was a mound. It stood 12 feet tall, a nightmare of packed mud, river silt, and Spanish moss. But as we got closer, the structural elements became clear. It wasn't just mud. It was reinforced with bone. Human femurs, rib cages, and skulls were woven into the architecture of the nest like rebar in concrete. It was a cathedral of the dead. Suddenly, a voice drifted from the interior of the mound. It was high-pitched, thin, and wavering. It called out a name. Bryce. It sounded like Bryce's sister, a woman I knew lived 3 parishes away. Then it called again, but the pitch shifted, becoming a perfect, digital mimicry of Bryce's own radio sign-off. The thing inside was using our own voices to bait the trap. Against every instinct of self-preservation, I slid into the water. There was a submerged opening at the base of the mound, a tunnel that felt like the throat of a beast. I swam into the dark, my lungs screaming, until I broke the surface in an air pocket inside the structure. The smell hit me then, an alkaline, chemical stench like burnt ozone and old copper. In the center of the chamber, sitting on a bed of crushed human teeth, was a clutch of 12 eggs. They were large, leathery, and translucent. I could see things moving inside them, pale, spindly shapes with too many joints. A pair of eyes opened in the darkness. They were flat, white, and reflective, like polished coins. The creature didn't growl. It didn't hiss. It moved with a speed that the human eye isn't wired to track. It was humanoid but elongated, its skin the color of a drowned man's belly. It launched itself at me, its limbs unfolding like a folding knife. I felt a claw graze my shoulder, a cold, searing line of pain, before a hand grabbed the collar of my vest and yanked me backward. Bo was there, dragging me out of the tunnel and back into the waist-deep sludge of the swamp. We ran, but you don't really run in the Atchafalaya. You struggle. You heave your body through the resistance of the water while the duckweed parts behind you in a violent, V-shaped wake. The creature was right there, a blur of white in the shadows, closing the gap with every second. We reached a capsized aluminum boat, a relic of some long-forgotten flood. Bo didn't hesitate. He grabbed me by the belt and heaved me onto the slick, upturned hull. I turned to pull him up, but he pushed my hand away. He stood in the water, his back to me, facing the ripple in the duckweed that marked the thing's approach. He looked back at me over his shoulder, his eyes calm, and held up 4 fingers, then closed his hand. 40 seconds. That was the price. He was going to hold it off, and I had exactly 40 seconds to make sure none of this ever walked out of the swamp. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. There wasn't time for the luxury of grief. I scrambled to the stern of the boat where the old outboard motor was still attached. I wrenched it free, the metal biting into my palms. I lugged the heavy, gasoline-soaked beast of a motor toward the mound, shoving it deep into the submerged tunnel. I ripped the fuel line open, letting the pungent scent of gasoline mask the smell of the nest. I scrambled back to the hull, pulled my flare gun, and aimed it at the shimmering slick of fuel blooming on the water's surface. The world turned orange. The explosion wasn't a bang. It was a roar that shook the very foundation of the basin. A column of fire erupted from the mound, turning the cypress trees into giant, flickering torches. The scream that came from inside that nest wasn't human, and it wasn't animal. It was the sound of 1,000 violin strings snapping at once. I sat on that boat, blinded by the heat, watching the graveyard burn. I survived. I crawled back to civilization with a story about a boating accident and a tragic loss. I filed a false report claiming Bo Gardner died in a freak engine explosion so his family could receive the line-of-duty death payout. I told them the mound was just a collection of driftwood and debris that caught a stray spark. They put it in the report like it was a victory. They recorded that 9 eggs were destroyed in the fire, cited as a win for public safety. But I was in that nest. I counted them with my own eyes. I didn't just see shapes. I counted the pulses of life behind the leathery shells. There were 12. Somewhere in the 1.4 million acres of the Atchafalaya, 3 of those things have hatched, and they're growing in the dark, waiting for the silence to return. They remember the man who brought the fire. And every night, when the wind whistles through the moss outside my window, it sounds exactly like my own voice calling me back to the water. The Atchafalaya Basin doesn't just swallow people, it digests them. It's a 1.4 million acre throat of cypress knees and black water, a place where the humidity feels like a wet shroud and the silence is a physical weight. I've spent 12 years as a wildlife enforcement officer in this green hell, and I've learned that the swamp has a rhythm, a pulse. But lately, that pulse has been skipping beats. People are disappearing. Not just the weekend warriors who get turned around by the shifting sandbars, but the lifers. The men who were born in a pirogue and will die with mud in their veins. Bryce Park was one of them. A veteran trapper who knew the interior of the basin better than his own heartbeat. When he missed 3 consecutive radio check-ins, the brass didn't send a search party. They sent me. Alone. Because in the deep interior, a crowd is just more noise for the swamp to eat. I pushed my skiff into the unnavigable guts of the basin, where the map turns into a grey smear of static. The water here is stagnant, a mirror of rotting vegetation and oil-slick mud. I found Bryce's camp near a cluster of ancient, weeping cypress. It was a scene cut short. A half-peeled muskrat hung from a hook, already buzzing with a frantic cloud of flies. His coffee pot was still warm, but the man was gone. Then I saw the trail. It wasn't the chaotic thrashing of a gator strike. It was 2 perfectly parallel drag marks leading from the center of the camp down into the murky water. They were deep, carved into the soft silt with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. Something heavy had been carried here. Not dragged behind, but carried straight and level, supported from the shoulders of whatever took him. It felt wrong. It felt calculated. I followed the trail into the thickets, the air growing colder, smelling of copper and wet wool. That's when I found him. Bryce wasn't on the ground. I looked up and saw his boots dangling 8 feet in the air, wedged into the crotch of a tupelo tree. I climbed up, my stomach churning. Bryce's chest cavity had been opened. It wasn't a tear or a bite. It was a series of smooth, deliberate cuts through the bone, like a surgeon had used a jagged shard of flint. There was no rot. In the 90-degree heat of a Louisiana afternoon, Bryce's body should have been a bloated mess within hours. Instead, he looked preserved. Waxy. Caching. A voice rasped from the shadows below. I nearly fell out of the tree. Bo Gardner, a veteran guide who had disappeared from the local bars months ago, was standing in the knee-deep muck. He looked like a ghost made of Spanish moss and trauma. He didn't have a gun. He just had a long, sharpened pole and eyes that looked like they'd seen the bottom of the void. He told me the things in the water don't eat right away. They store. They let the meat settle in the cool, shaded heights or the deep, anaerobic mud where the bacteria can't get to it. Bo didn't wait for me to process the horror. He turned and waded deeper, his movements fluid and silent. I followed him, my duty-issued sidearm feeling like a toy in the face of whatever had filleted Bryce Park. We reached the graveyard mound an hour later. It was a nightmare of architecture. A 12-foot-high dome of packed mud and moss built directly into the massive, tangled roots of a dead cypress. But it wasn't just mud. As I got closer, the static in my head grew louder. White slivers poked out of the structure. I realized with a jolt of ice-cold dread that the mound was reinforced with human bones. Femurs, ribs, and skulls were woven into the mud like rebar, creating a cathedral of the missing. Bo pointed to the base. There were 2 more bodies wedged into the root system, their chests opened with that same surgical, jagged precision. I recognized the faces from the missing flyers pinned to the station's corkboard. They were fresh. They were being saved. A sound drifted out from the dark, submerged opening at the base of the mound. It was a voice. Thin, reedy, and high-pitched. It was calling a name. Sherry. Sherry, help me. It was the voice of a man who had been missing for 3 weeks. But the cadence was wrong. It was flat, mechanical, like a recording played on a loop. It was a lure. Don't, Bo whispered, but I was already moving. I'm a lawman. I couldn't leave someone in there. I drew my breath and dove into the black, oily water, swimming into the tunnel beneath the mound. The water felt like liquid lead. I broke the surface inside an air pocket in the center of the structure. The smell hit me first, a cloying, sweet stench of fermentation and old blood. My flashlight beam cut through the dark and landed on the nest. There were 12 of them. Large, leathery eggs, the color of a bruised lung, huddled together in a bed of shredded clothing. And standing over them was the architect. It was humanoid, but the proportions were a violent insult to nature. Its limbs were too long, ending in talons that looked like blackened ivory. Its skin was the translucent gray of a drowned corpse, stretched tight over a frame of corded muscle. When it turned, its eyes caught the light, flat, white, reflective orbs that held no pupils, only a hunger that felt like a physical weight. It didn't roar. It didn't growl. It just moved. It was a blur of gray motion, closing the distance in the cramped space with a speed that defied physics. I fired my sidearm, the flash blinding me in the confined space, but the creature was already on me. A cold, wet hand slammed into my chest, pinning me against the wall of bones. I felt a rib snap. The creature leaned in, its jaw unhinging to reveal rows of needle-thin teeth, and then I heard that voice again, vibrating from its throat. "Sherry, help me." Suddenly, a hand grabbed my collar and yanked me backward. Bo had followed me in. He shoved his sharpened pole into the creature's chest, buying me a second of life. "Run!" he screamed, his voice cracking the oppressive silence of the mound. We scrambled back through the tunnel, the water churning behind us. We broke the surface and fled through the waist-deep swamp. The creature was right behind us. I could see the duckweed parting in a violent V-shape, a wake of pure malice cutting through the greenery. It was faster than us. It was in its element. We reached a capsized aluminum boat, half buried in the mud near a clearing. Bo grabbed me by the belt and hoisted me onto the slick hull. I reached down to pull him up, but he pushed my hand away. He looked back at the closing wake, then at me. 40 seconds, he said, his voice calm, almost hollow. "That's all I can give you. Make it count, officer." He turned and waded back into the path of the creature, drawing a jagged knife. The water exploded. I didn't watch. I couldn't. I listened to the sound of splashing and the sickening wet thuds of a struggle as I scrambled to the back of the boat where the old outboard motor was still attached. I ripped the motor free from its mount with a strength born of pure, unadulterated terror. I dragged the heavy machine to the edge of the mound's tunnel, my breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. I opened the fuel line, letting the pungent scent of gasoline drown out the smell of the swamp. I shoved the motor deep into the throat of the nest, the fuel spilling out over the leathery eggs and the floor of bones. I backed away, pulling my flare gun from my belt. I saw the creature emerge from the water 20 feet away. It was covered in Bo's blood. It looked at me, its white eyes reflecting the orange light of the flare I was about to fire. I pulled the trigger. The mound didn't just burn, it detonated. The trapped gasoline fumes ignited in a massive column of fire that tore through the cypress roots and sent a shockwave through the water. The heat was a physical blow, searing the hair from my arms. I watched as the cathedral of bones collapsed into a pyre, the screeching of the creature lost in the roar of the flames. I survived. I don't know how I made it back to the outpost, but I did. I filed my report. I told them Bo Gardner died a hero in a boating accident, a lie designed to ensure his family got his line-of-duty death payout. They didn't need to know about the mound. They didn't need to know about the things that mimic our voices. The official recovery team went out a week later. They found the charred remains of the nest. The report states that 9 eggs were destroyed in the fire. But I was there. I was in that air pocket. I counted them. There were 12. I know the math. Somewhere in the 1.4 million acre dark of the Atchafalaya, 3 of those things have hatched, and they're growing in the dark, waiting for the silence to return. They remember the man who brought the fire. And every night, when the wind whistles through the moss outside my window, it sounds exactly like my own voice calling me back to the water. The Atchafalaya Basin does not forgive, and it certainly does not forget. It is a world of green twilight and black water, a sprawling labyrinth of cypress knees and Spanish moss that hangs like the tattered funeral shrouds of 1,000 forgotten men. When you work as a wildlife enforcement officer in the deep interior, you learn to read the silence. There is a healthy silence, the kind where the cicadas rest and the gators drift, and then there is the static silence, the kind that feels like a weight on your chest, a void where sound should be. That was the silence that greeted me when I pushed my skiff into the unnavigable heart of the basin to find Bryce Park. Bryce was a veteran trapper, a man made of leather and gristle who had survived 50 years of swamp fever and water moccasins. He was supposed to check in every 12 hours. After 36 hours of radio silence, I knew I wasn't going on a rescue mission. I was going on a recovery. The deeper I pushed into the interior, the more the swamp seemed to close ranks behind me. The water changed from a murky brown to a viscous, oily black that didn't ripple so much as it parted. I found his camp on a small, nameless hummock of high ground. It looked like a photograph that had been interrupted. A pot of coffee sat cold on a dead stove. A half-skinned nutria lay on the bench, covered in a shimmering carpet of flies. But there was no struggle, no blood, just the absence of a man. I stepped off the skiff, my boots sinking into the sulphurous mud. That's when I saw the trail. They weren't the chaotic, thrashing marks of an alligator dragging a kill. These were two perfectly parallel lines, deep and deliberate, carved into the silt. They led from the center of the camp straight into the water. Whatever had taken Bryce hadn't dragged him by the leg or the torso. It had carried him, level and steady, with his weight distributed evenly. It looked like something had walked backward into the dark, holding him by the shoulders like a precious cargo. I followed the direction of the marks, my flashlight cutting through the gathering fog. A few hundred yards in, I found the first cache. I almost missed it. I happened to look up, and there, 8 feet above the waterline, wedged into the fork of a massive, ancient cypress, was Bryce. He was positioned as if he were sleeping, his back against the bark. But when my light hit his chest, my stomach turned over. His chest cavity had been opened. It wasn't a jagged tear. It was a series of smooth, surgical cuts that had parted the ribs like a picket fence. His organs were gone, replaced with packed Spanish moss and river silt. Despite the sweltering Louisiana heat, there was no smell of rot. The body looked fresh, preserved in some unnatural, antiseptic stasis. A shadow shifted in the peripheral of my light. I spun, my hand on my sidearm, but it was just Bo Gardner. Bo was a guide who had been born in a pirogue and would likely die in one. He had followed my wake, moving through the trees like a ghost. He didn't say a word. He just pointed at the tree, then at the water. He whispered one word, caching. Like a leopard stores its kill or a shrike pins an insect to a thorn. We weren't dealing with an animal that ate out of hunger. We were dealing with something that was stockpiling. Bo led the way deeper, his movements fluid and silent. We found 2 more. A missing birdwatcher from Baton Rouge and a surveyor who had vanished 3 weeks prior. Both were stored high in the trees, their chests opened with that same terrifying precision, their eyes replaced with smooth, river-worn stones. They were being kept. They were being curated. We tracked the entity for hours, the swamp growing increasingly hostile. The trees grew closer together, their roots weaving into impenetrable walls. Finally, we saw it. Rising out of the black water was a mound. It was 12 feet tall, a massive, conical structure built from packed mud, rotting vegetation, and something white that caught the light. As we got closer, I realized the white wasn't stone or wood. It was bone. Human femurs, ribs, and skulls were woven into the structure, acting as a skeletal rebar for the mud. It was a cathedral of the dead, anchored to the massive roots of a dead cypress. As we hovered near the base of the mound, a sound drifted out from the interior. It was a voice. Thin, reedy, and full of a mechanical tremor. It called out a name. Bryce. Then it called my name. It didn't sound like a person talking. It sounded like a recording of a person talking, played back through a throat made of wet leather. It was mimicry, a lure designed to pull the curious into the dark. I looked at Bo, and he gave me a grim nod. We couldn't leave this thing to grow. I took a deep breath, checked my light, and slipped into the water. There was a submerged opening at the base of the mound, a tunnel that smelled of iron and old copper. I swam through the dark, my hands brushing against the smooth, cold walls of the tunnel until I broke the surface into an internal air pocket. The interior of the mound was a nightmare. The walls were lined with the same preserved human remains I'd seen in the trees, but here, they were woven into the very fabric of the nest. In the center of the chamber, sitting on a bed of crushed bone, was the clutch. 12 eggs, each the size of a watermelon, leathery and translucent. I could see things moving inside them. Sinuous, pale shapes that shifted in the flickering light of my waterproof torch. Then I felt the shift in the air. Across the chamber, a shadow detached itself from the wall. It was humanoid, but the proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were too long, its joints multi-hinged, and its skin had the pale, sickly sheen of a blind cave fish. It had no nose, no ears, just a wide, lipless slit of a mouth and 2 flat, white eyes that reflected my light with a terrifying, predatory intelligence. It didn't growl. It didn't hiss. It just launched. It moved with a speed that defied the physics of the cramped space. I fired my sidearm, the muzzle flashes illuminating the creature's translucent skin as it closed the gap. I felt a hand like a vice grip my shoulder, and for a second, I thought it was the end. But it was Bo. He had followed me in, and he was already dragging me back toward the tunnel. The creature slammed into the water behind us, the force of its movement creating a vacuum that nearly pulled the air from my lungs. We scrambled out of the mound and into the waist-deep water of the swamp. We ran, but running in the basin is a slow-motion nightmare. The duckweed and lily pads acted like a shroud, clinging to our legs. Behind us, the water began to part. The creature was coming, moving with a violent, rhythmic surge that sent ripples through the moss. It was closing the distance. We reached a capsized aluminum boat, half buried in the silt. Bo grabbed me by the collar and heaved me onto the slick, upturned hull. "Go," Bo gasped, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He didn't try to climb up. He stayed in the water, his back against the boat, his hunting knife drawn. He looked at me, a man who had spent his whole life in these woods and knew when his time was up. He told me I had 40 seconds. Exactly 40 seconds to make it count. The creature breached the surface 10 feet away, its white eyes fixed on him, its mouth opening to reveal rows of needle-like teeth that vibrated with that horrific, mimicked voice. I didn't waste time screaming. I crawled to the stern where the old outboard motor was still attached by a safety chain. I heaved the heavy, rusted hunk of metal and fuel tank toward the mound's submerged entrance. I shoved the motor and the gas can as deep into the tunnel as I could reach, ripping the fuel line open. The smell of gasoline filled the air, thick and volatile. I scrambled back onto the boat, grabbed my flare gun, and waited until the creature was inches from Bo. The world turned orange. The flare ignited the trapped fumes inside the mound, and the resulting explosion was a pillar of fire that lit up the basin for miles. The mound didn't just burn, it disintegrated. A column of heat and pressure erupted from the center, vaporizing the mud and bone and whatever lived inside. The shockwave knocked me off the boat and into the black water. When I surfaced, the mound was a charred skeleton of cypress roots, and the creature was gone, consumed by the same fire it had used to lure its prey. I never found Bo. I stayed there until the sun came up, screaming his name until my throat was raw, but the only response was the crackle of burning wood and the distant, indifferent calls of the herons. I made it back to civilization 3 days later. I filed a false report. I told the department that Bo Gardner had died in a tragic boating accident, a fuel leak that turned into an explosion. I did it so his family would get the line of duty death payout. They deserved that much. But the official file haunts me more than the lie. The investigative team went out to the site 2 weeks later. They combed through the ashes of the mound and the surrounding water. Their report stated that they found the remains of 9 eggs, charred and destroyed by the heat of the blast. I haven't slept since I read that report, because I was in that chamber. I had my light on that clutch for 3 full minutes while I searched for a way out. I didn't count 9 eggs. I explicitly, clearly counted 12. Somewhere in that 1.4 million acres of black water and ancient cypress, 3 of those things have hatched, and they're growing in the dark, waiting for the silence to return. They remember the man who brought the fire. And every night, when the wind whistles through the moss outside my window, it sounds exactly like my own voice calling me back to the water. The water wasn't water anymore. It was a thick, necrotic sludge that clung to my uniform like a shroud. Every step felt like wading through a soup of wet velvet and ground bone. Behind us, the wake was widening. Something was horizontal in that black void, cutting through the duckweed with a precision that defied biology. It didn't splash. It didn't ripple. It simply displaced the world around it, a silent, predatory static moving through the dark. I could hear Bo's breath ahead of me, a ragged, mechanical grinding in his chest. He didn't look back. You don't look back when the Atchafalaya decides it's done sharing. We hit the clearing where the old aluminum skiff sat upturned against a cypress knee, its hull bleached white like the belly of a dead fish. The creature was maybe 20 feet back, a pale, flickering shape just beneath the surface. I saw those flat, white eyes catch the dim light, 2 coins of silver reflecting a moon that wasn't there. They were eyes that had never seen a sun, eyes that only knew the geometry of the hunt. Bo grabbed me by the collar of my vest. His hands were like iron clamps, wet and trembling. With a grunt that sounded like tearing leather, he heaved me upward. My fingers scraped against the slick, algae-covered metal of the boat's bottom. I scrambled up, my boots kicking air, until I hauled myself onto the narrow sanctuary of the hull. I turned, reaching back for him, but Bo stayed in the waist-deep rot. He wasn't reaching up. He was standing tall, his chest heaving, staring into the dark where the wake was closing in. "Go," he spat. The word was wet, heavy with the phlegm of a man who knew he was already a ghost. "Bo, get up here." I screamed, my voice cracking, sounding thin and pathetic against the oppressive silence of the trees. He didn't move. He reached into his belt and pulled out a heavy skinning knife, the blade dull and stained with years of swamp grease. He looked at me then. His face was a map of deep shadows, his eyes hollowed out by a sudden, terrifying clarity. 40 seconds, he whispered. Not a heartbeat more. Give them the fire, kid. Give it all to them. The water erupted. The creature didn't jump. It unfolded. It was a nightmare of pale, translucent skin and elongated limbs that moved with the twitchy, unpredictable speed of a centipede. It hit Bo with the force of a car wreck. I heard his ribs snap, a dry, wooden sound that echoed off the cypress trunks. But Bo didn't scream. He wrapped his arms around the thing's slick, necklace torso, burying his knife into the rubbery meat of its shoulder. They went down together into the black bile of the basin. The timer in my head started ticking. 1, 2. I scrambled to the stern of the capsized boat where the old 25 horsepower Johnson motor was still bolted to the transom, hanging precariously over the edge. My fingers were slick with mud and panic. I fumbled for the mounting brackets, twisting the rusted wing nuts until the skin peeled off my palms. 10, 11. The water 5 feet away was a boiling cauldron of froth and blood, dark, oily blood that smelled like copper and old graves. I saw Bo's head surface for a fraction of a second, his teeth bared in a snarl, before he was yanked back under. The creature's tail, or whatever that whipping, corded muscle was, lashed out and cracked against the side of the boat, nearly throwing me back into the drink. 18, 19. The motor gave way. I hauled the heavy, greasy mass of metal toward me, the weight nearly snapping my spine. I didn't think about the physics. I didn't think about the impossibility of it. I dragged it toward the mouth of the submerged tunnel, the entrance to that bone-packed mound we had just fled. The motor's fuel line was leaking, a rainbow sheen of gasoline spreading across the black water. 25, 26. I jammed the motor into the opening of the mound, shoving it deep into the throat of the nest. I reached for the fuel tank, twisting the cap off and shoving the hose directly into the air pocket where I knew those 12 leathery eggs were waiting. The smell of gasoline was a violent intrusion on the swamp's ancient stinking breath. It was the smell of the modern world, of destruction, of the end. 32, 33. I looked back at the water. It was still. Too still. A patch of Bo's flannel shirt floated to the surface, followed by a slow, rising plume of red. There was no more splashing, no more struggling, just the sound of the swamp drinking. 38, 39. I pulled the flare gun from my waterproof holster. My hand was shaking so violently I had to use both palms to steady the grip. I didn't look for Bo anymore. I didn't look for the creature. I aimed at the mouth of the tunnel, at the shimmering slick of fuel that coated the entrance of that unholy grave. 40. I pulled the trigger. The world turned inside out. The flare hit the gasoline and the entire mound transformed into a pressurized bomb. A pillar of orange fire roared out of the mud, screaming like a jet engine as the trapped fumes ignited within the air pocket. The force of the blast threw me backward off the boat and into the shallows. The sound was a physical blow, a wall of heat that scorched the hair off my arms and turned the Spanish moss into falling embers. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard it, a high-pitched, multi-tonal shriek that didn't come from a throat. It was the sound of something ancient and wrong being cooked alive. The mound disintegrated, the packed mud and human bones raining down in a grotesque confetti of soot and ash. I pulled myself onto a floating log, my lungs burning, watching the inferno eat the darkness. The fire reflected off the water, turning the basin into a lake of liquid gold and blood. I waited for Bo to surface. I waited for 10 minutes, then 20, until the fire died down to a low, guttering hiss and the only sound left was the crackle of burning cypress. He never came up. The rescue team found me 2 days later, wandering the levee 3 miles out, my skin blistered and my eyes glazed with a 1,000-yard stare. I told them the story they wanted to hear. I told them Bo Gardner was a hero who died trying to save me from a freak gas explosion when my motor hit a submerged cypress knee. I made sure the paperwork was airtight. I made sure his wife got the full line of duty payout. It was the only thing I could give him. But the official report from the recovery divers, the ones who went down into the charred remains of that mound 2 weeks later, is what keeps me awake. They found the remnants of the nest. They found the scorched, blackened husks of the eggs I had tried to destroy. They counted them, one by one, cataloging the fragments of a nightmare. The report says they found 9. I didn't tell them I had counted 12. I didn't tell them about the 3 empty spaces in the muck, or the way the tunnel seemed to have been clawed open from the inside before the fire reached its peak. Now, I sit on my porch in the reach of the Atchafalaya, the night air thick enough to chew. Every time the wind shifts, I smell that sulphurous rot. Every time a shadow moves in the tall grass, I see those flat, white eyes. 9 eggs died in the fire, but 3 of those things have hatched, and they're growing in the dark, waiting for the silence to return. They remember the man who brought the fire. And every night, when the wind whistles through the moss outside my window, it sounds exactly like my own voice calling me back to the water. It's a mimicry that never quite hits the right note, a hollow, vibrating frequency that vibrates in my teeth. They are out there, learning. They are learning my name. They are learning how to sound like the people I love. And I know, as surely as the tide pulls the salt into the marsh, that one night I won't just hear the voice. I'll see the wake. And this time, there won't be any 40 seconds left to save me. The fluorescent lights in the precinct office don't just hum. They scream in a frequency only the traumatized can hear. It's a jagged, electric vibration that scrapes against the inside of my skull, a sterile white noise meant to drown out the wet, sucking sounds of the Atchafalaya. I sit here, my fingers hovering over the keys of a standard-issue laptop, the plastic clicking like the mandibles of something hungry. My skin feels tight, scorched by the fire but still somehow damp with the memory of that stagnant, waist-deep rot. Every time I blink, I see the afterimage of the flare gun's flash, a blooming crimson flower in a garden of black water and grey moss. I filed the report an hour ago. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. I described the choppy waters, the malfunctioning fuel line on Bo's old aluminum skiff, and the tragic, sudden explosion that claimed the life of a veteran guide. I painted Bo Gardner as a man taken by the very element he spent his life protecting. It's a clean lie, a heroic lie. It ensures his widow gets the line of duty benefits, the pension, the folded flag, and the dignity of a closed casket that isn't empty. Because if I told the truth, if I wrote about the mounds of packed mud and human marrow, the way Bryce Park's ribcage looked like a birdcage for a missing soul, or the way Bo's eyes looked when he stayed in the water, they'd lock me in a room with padded walls and never let me see the sun again. But the paper is lying to me too. I have the official recovery photographs spread out across the laminate desk. They're cold, clinical things. High-definition captures of the scorched earth where the mound used to be. The forensic team went in after the fires died down, sifting through the charcoal and the calcined bone. The report is sitting there in black and white, stamped by the coroner and the lead investigator. It says they found the remains of 9 eggs. 9 calcified, leathery husks, shattered and cooked from the inside out by the ignited gasoline. 9. I closed my eyes and I was back in that air pocket. I could smell the suffocating musk of the creature, the scent of wet fur and ancient, stagnant silt. I could feel the heat radiating from my own panic heartbeat. I remember the count. I remember the way the beam of my waterproof light skipped over them like stones across a dark pond. I didn't just see them, I felt them. 12. There were 12 of those pale, pulsing shapes nestled in the roots. I counted them with the frantic precision of a man looking for a way out. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 12. 3 are missing. That realization is a cold blade sliding between my vertebrae. 3 of those things aren't ash. 3 of those things didn't burst under the pressure of the explosion. The forensic team didn't find them because they weren't there to be found. Maybe the blast didn't kill them. Maybe it just moved them. Or maybe, while Bo was holding that pale, eyeless nightmare back, while I was fumbling with the motor and the fuel line, something else was moving in the dark. Something smaller. Something faster. The swamp is a vast, unmapped void of 1.4 million acres. It is a labyrinth of cypress knees and floating duckweed, a place where the geography shifts with every rain and every tide. A place where 3 leathery eggs could be tucked into the hollow of a rotting log or carried in the mouth of a surviving parent to a new, even deeper sanctuary. I look at my hands. They are shaking. I try to tell myself it's the caffeine or the lack of sleep, but I know it's the static. The world feels like a television screen tuned to a dead channel. Everything is grey and flickering. I can't stop thinking about the way that creature looked, the flat, white, reflective eyes that didn't just see me, but seemed to recognize the meat underneath the uniform. It wasn't an animal. It was a predator that had spent generations learning the shape of our shadows. And now, it's learning more. The voice I heard inside the mound, it wasn't just a mimicry. It was a lure. It was using a name to bridge the gap between the wild and the known. It was studying the sounds we make when we are afraid, the way we call out for help, the specific vibrations of our grief. If 3 of them survived, they aren't just growing, they're evolving. They are the heirs to a kingdom of mud and bone, and they have the memory of fire burned into their collective instinct. I look toward the window, but I only see my own reflection against the dark glass of the precinct. Beyond that glass, the Louisiana night is thick and heavy. The humidity feels like a wet shroud. I know that out there, past the streetlights and the highway, the basin is waiting. It's breathing. The tide is pulling the salt into the marsh, and the water is rising. I think about the 40 seconds Bo gave me. It was a gift of time bought with his life. But time is a circle in the swamp. It loops back on itself until you're right back where you started, waist deep in the dark, waiting for the ripple that doesn't belong. They are out there, learning. They are learning my name. They are learning how to sound like the people I love. I can hear the phantom whisper of my own name in the hum of the air conditioner. It sounds like my mother. It sounds like Bo. It sounds like a death warrant. And I know, as surely as the rot takes the fallen oak, that one night soon, I won't just hear the voice. I'll see the wake in the water. I'll see those flat, white eyes reflected in the moonlight. And this time, there won't be a sacrifice. This time, there won't be any 40 seconds left to save me. There will only be the cold, the dark, and the long, slow drag into the silent deep. The fluorescent light above me flickers and dies, leaving me in the grey static of the office. In the sudden silence, I hear it. A soft, wet slap against the linoleum. Just once. Then nothing but the sound of my own breath, ragged and thin, as I wait for the dark to speak back.